Hey, you're listening to a Bible Brodown podcast, a member of the Trinity Commission. This is where brothers come together to sharpen one another so we can rightly divide the Word of God. I'm Matt.
And this is Billy.
And we're back. Well, that's kind of a lie. We're not back. I'm back. So Billy, this is Matt, by the way. Billy has taken social distancing to the extreme. And, you know, he does secret government stuff. That's his job. I don't even know all the details, but I'm pretty sure he is on the International Space Station doing interviews for people, you know, background stuff for the new U.S. space program. So I'm pretty sure that's definitely maybe the where he is at the moment. No chance he's going to get coronavirus because he's not even on the planet at the moment. But yeah, no, he's good. I'm good. Our family's safe and healthy. I hope all of you are safe and healthy. This whole social distancing thing, I get the point, right? I don't want anybody, like if I'm infected, I don't want to share it. And if somebody else is infected, I don't want to get it. So I get it. Distance. On the other hand, you know, we all feel a little icky about the government saying you shouldn't gather together. Now, they're not focusing specifically on churches. Otherwise, that would be a huge deal. They're telling it to everybody. They're like, hey, don't take your whole family to Walmart. Don't, you know, and that stuff's great. Don't do that. On the day when some, you know, down the road, not right now, but down the road when they're like, really, we just need all the churches to stop gathering. Then we'll all start to fuss a lot louder. But right now, I think it's a good thing. Stay safe. Let this all. We want a slow burn. We don't want it to all pile up and have a whole bunch of people in the hospital who can't get help. We've seen that in Italy. So that's a, you know, little PSA from Matt. But yeah, I hope all of you are safe and healthy and yeah, we actually, there's been some people in the community who have lost loved ones. Well, one in particular that my wife and I knew that it's just a sad situation and from the virus. So yeah, I don't want that to happen to any of you. But anyway, to the topic at hand. What was it? A few weeks ago, we did a mini cast on the knowledge of good and evil, and we didn't explain it. Instead, we just asked a bunch of questions, right? We wanted to kind of explain where our head was and the issues we had with how to interpret the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and what it was that Adam and Eve did or gained or lost by eating that. So, just to recap real quick, some people believe, and this was before we had read anything, and what I'm going to do today is go through a couple of articles that I found that propose some answers. One of them I was on board with until I got to their conclusion, and I was like, whoa, that came out of left field, and we'll talk about that one first. And then the second one hits the point that I eventually landed on, and I think they're right. So the issue is when Adam and Eve are told, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we say, well, what is the knowledge of good and evil? Is it just, well, now they know good and evil? I mean, like just how it sounds, right? They know what good and evil is. Then how did they understand the command in the first place? If they didn't know what good or evil was, like morally right or wrong, then why was there even a discussion with the serpent? Why didn't Eve just go, yeah, I'm going to eat the tree? I mean, like it just makes the entire command in the first place moot if they didn't understand not to eat it, right? So it's not just simply a moral thing. And in the first article here that we're going to look at by Frederick Carl Iselin, he does point that out as well. He dismisses the moral argument. But the other thing is, well, why is it that they immediately, so whatever it is they gain, this is something that they gain, by the way, because God says, well, now they're like us. And we talked about who us might be, but now they're like us. After they eat, Adam and Eve were good before they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God was satisfied with them. He made them in his image, right? They eat from the tree, and now they're like us. So they gained something, obviously. They gained something. And then because of the fall, they lost a relationship. So it was in addition to their being in some way, but or to their knowledge, but a loss in terms of their relationship to God. And I know some people have quibbled about, you know, well, no, it was overall as a loss. Well, yes, it was, but they did gain knowledge. There's no denying that. That's the point of the eating. So they gained something that made them more like God. But could it be? It couldn't be the experience of evil, because nobody would say that God has experienced evil. Evil doesn't come from him. Evil is the opposite of him. It's what he wouldn't do, right? So kind of in my own mind, just chewing on it slowly over the last few weeks, and I got to the point where my answer, the way I would word it to people, is that I think that Adam and Eve, by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, so prior to, they had one command. Prior to doing that, they had never done anything against the will of God. When they ate, they realized they had the opportunity or the option to do something other than what he had told them to do. And I think that's the gaining of the knowledge of good and evil, meaning they can now decide to do what he's asked or to do something else, ultimately becoming the determiner for themselves of what they should or shouldn't do. And I can see how that makes them like God. Not that he's experienced evil, but he knows that they have options. I mean, the angels have already rebelled, so he knows that that his free creatures could choose to reject him and go their own way. And until Adam and Eve had that first sin, that first miss the mark, right? They did not know that there was another option. Ultimately, it leads to death. It's not like it's an option that leads to eternal life by themselves. That's not going to work. But they didn't realize that they could rebel until they did, and now they knew. And one of the articles we're going to look at, the second one, is going to say that more eloquently than I just did. But yeah, that's the only thing that seems to make sense to me, and we'll talk about it a little more. But the first one, again, this is called the tree of. By the way, if you've ever used JSTOR, you can see JSTOR.org. It's fantastic. If you ever go looking for, if you're just a regular dude like me and you're not associated with any particular school, you're not signed up as a student, and you don't have access to these scholarly articles, you're going to have a hard time finding them because you'll search for it. Maybe you go to scholar.google.com and you type in a title or type in a subject and you find a title that sounds like something you want to read. You click on it and they're like $34 to read this article. And you're like, no, I'm not doing that. JSTOR has made a lot of their stuff free. And even if it's not free, you can sign up through them. And like every month you get 5 or so free. You can view one that's behind a paywall, but you can view that for free as well. So it's awesome. Being able to go through some of these older articles and take a look at what people have said. And what's cool to me is, so this is called The Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil. It's by Frederick Carl Iceland. It was from the Biblical World, Volume 36, number 2, in 1910. This is not a new thing people have thought about. And even the objections that we've raised are not new objections that people have thought about. So in case you're like, man, Billy and Matt are always asking these weird off-the-wall questions. Yeah, other people have to. So it's cool. But this first one, so he starts off the article by talking about the language, linguistically, what can we gain from the words good and evil, or knowledge of good and evil. And in his conclusion, I'm not going to read all that. I'm just going to jump to his conclusion on that section. Linguistically, therefore, there is little in favor of the view which sees in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil a tree whose fruit may supply the capacity for making moral distinctions. On the other hand, there is much in favor of the view which sees in the Genesis passage a reference to the power of distinguishing between things useful and harmful, pleasant and unpleasant, advantageous and disadvantageous, or even in a more general sense, knowledge of everything, or knowledge in general. His point is, these different meanings of the phrase good and evil are recognized even by some who defend the moral interpretation, but they insist that the context of the Genesis passages decides the case in favor of the moral interpretation. So we'll get into the moral interpretation in a second. Linguistically, all he's saying is there's not a lot in the phrase knowledge of good and evil that really helps us kind of discern what's happening here. And that's fine. I've explained when Billy and I have done some of our episodes that knowing the language, so if you're interpreting the Bible, it's a lot like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Knowing the language and knowing exactly what each of these words mean, their semantical range, is like clearly outlining each puzzle piece. You know exactly the shape that it is, but you don't necessarily know how it fits. So all he's saying is that linguistically, we can see these puzzle pieces very clearly, but it doesn't tell us exactly what the picture's supposed to be. That's fine. I mean, that's part of exegesis. That's not all of it, right? So moving on, he talks about the moral interpretation. This is something that I've already reviewed. It's just saying that the Adam and Eve, after eating from the tree, knew what good and evil was. They knew moral choices. Oh, I can do good or I can do evil. But that position makes the entire command in the first place moot, because if they didn't know good and evil when he said don't eat from that, then they didn't know it was evil not to eat from that, and so they would have just done it. It doesn't make much sense to me. And also, how would they be like God if they didn't know good and evil? It seems to make them subhuman prior to actually eating from the tree, and not like him. But after they ate from the tree, then they knew good and evil morally, and that made them like him, but that was a bad thing. It just does not fit. Those pieces don't fit together right. So that I rejected that jigsaw puzzle version of this explanation. So then he gets down to, this is where he threw me off, because I was like, we're on page 9 of this article, and I was tracking along. He's making some good points. I'm agreeing with a lot of what he's saying. He's seeing that the bigger picture, and then maybe I don't know. I'm just going to read some of this, and then we'll talk about it. Moreover, what new knowledge came to? So I keep interrupting myself. Now he's looking at the context. He's saying, okay, well we've looked at the puzzle pieces, and clarifying them doesn't help. We've looked at one explanation for what might be happening, but that doesn't make sense. There's logical problems. And he's saying, okay, so let's back up and look at let's try to fit these puzzle pieces together with the surrounding context and see what makes sense. What is it that the people are gaining? Adam and Eve did something and they gained something. What is it that they got out of this? And his answer might surprise you. Moreover, what new knowledge came to the man and woman through the eating? Genesis 3:6-7 reads, She took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and she gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. This knowledge of that they were naked, the author believes, came to them as a result of the eating. For he says in 2:25, before the accounting of the eating, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. And in 3:11, Jehovah inquires, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded that thou shouldest not eat? The feeling of shame spoken of here is evidently the feeling of modesty and shyness due to a recognition on the part of the man and woman of a difference in sex. Hence, Gunkel is right in saying, Genesis, can't read that citation, that the first result of the eating was sex consciousness. Yeah, you heard me right. The first result of the eating was sex consciousness. At this point, as has been indicated before, confusion arises in the minds of many interpreters because the results of the eating and the results of the disobedience involved in the eating. The conscious and voluntary choice of the wrong brought an evil conscience and fear. But the first item of knowledge which came as a result of the eating was sex consciousness. So, just to be clear, what he's saying is that when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they looked at each other and went, wait a minute, you're a girl and I'm a guy. And that's why they were like, we should cover up. Let me read a little more, and then I'm just going to kind of destroy this in my own way. Dillman, therefore, is wrong when he states concerning this shame, the awakening sense of shame is the immediate accompaniment of sin. Without sin, there is no shame. It is the involuntary witness of a violated innocence. That makes sense to me. What Dillman is saying is that when they ate, they had not experienced any kind of shame before. And so when they did eat, they felt ashamed of themselves for having violated the rule of God. And the first thing that they thought to do was to hide themselves. Not necessarily, I'm naked, I need to cover up, but just to hide away. And that's why God goes looking for them, right? And then he sees that they're clothed or covering themselves. But the author here says that's incorrect. No. This is no more true of the first man and woman than it is today of children who arrive at the stage of sex consciousness. And the author knew human nature too well to make the blunder. He connects the dawn of sex consciousness with the eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not with the disobedience as such. That the dawn of sex consciousness is independent of sin is admitted by Gordon. Okay, yeah, he's going to go into some other stuff. So the Adam and Eve, let's just think through this real quick. God made Adam out of dirt. He gave him a job to do. Go name the animals, take care of this place. Basically, he gave him dominion over certain stuff. And God said it's not right for man to be alone. I'm going to make him a helper, a helpmate. And whether or not we take this literally, and it was just one man and one woman, or if you believe that Adam and Eve are literal, not literal, kind of metaphorical, it's just a literary way of talking about humanity at the time, I don't think really matters. The point is that the character Adam and the character Adam had nobody, and then God from him created a woman to be his helper. And if these are two literal people, this is the first woman he's seen. Just as a man, if it's just been me and a bunch of animals, and then I see the first woman ever, she's literally the most beautiful woman on earth. I'm gonna know immediately she's not like me. I mean, she is like me, right? She's human, but she's not like me, and she's pretty. And without getting too, I mean, that's my wife, right? Sex consciousness, I think, would have happened immediately at the time of creation of Eve. I don't imagine that he looked at her and was like, I guess she's a guy too. Or if he didn't understand male and female, like there are animals, right? I assume there's probably births. The animals are doing what animals do and procreating. I can't fathom that he didn't understand how that worked. and so that the idea that eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil somehow like opened their eyes like, oh, whoa, we're a man and woman. We should cover up. I mean, even then, why did that cause them to want to cover up? It just doesn't make sense to me. And another little piece of the puzzle, he doesn't mention it here, but I was thinking about it, and I've asked Billy this before too. You have one of the punishments of the fall being, I will multiply your pains in childbirth. God tells Eve this, right? How did Eve have any context for what that meant? Before, I mean, if God's essentially telling her, hey, childbirth is going to be harder, what does that mean to someone who's never had a baby? Did she have children before the fall, and now she has some context for, oh, this is harder? Or was it just kind of a, hey, by the way, this is going to suck when it happens kind of thing? Like, I don't know. I tend to think maybe she had already had some kids. And if you look at the account of her having Cain and Abel, I don't recall if it says, and I'll look this up and correct myself in the next episode if I'm wrong, but I don't recall it saying that it was their first two children. Similar with Seth, I don't think it says, and their third kid was. It just says, and they conceived and had a child, and his name was Seth. So I don't know. The idea that sex consciousness is what happened at the eating of the knowledge, that's the knowledge that they gained, seems a little absurd to me. And I was pretty disappointed that he went off the rails here and took that direction. And it is interesting. So both of these articles, both of these authors come from the school of thought that the Pentateuch is written by 4 different sources: JEDP, the Jehovahist or Yahwehist, the Elohist, Deuteronomist, and the priestly sources. And there are some people who disagree with that. I think Mike Heiser disagrees with the JEDP theory. I don't really have a dog in that hunt. I don't care at this point. Maybe we'll get into that someday, but at the moment, it doesn't matter. Just so you know, when he says J, and if you go look at these articles yourself, when he's talking about J, he's talking about the Jehovahist. And it's a particular author, these people think, that they credit certain parts of the Pentateuch to them. And what is interesting is that the author here tries to connect the idea of sex consciousness with some kind of greater theme that Jay is developing over the course of the Pentateuch, where he talks about, so I'm going to read this little section here. To Jay belong also, in addition to some portions of no importance in this inquiry, the story of Cain and Abel and the line of Cain, the apostate sons of God, the decree to send the flood on account of the wickedness of man, the story of the flood in some form, Noah's drunkenness and the curse of Canaan, part of the genealogical table in chapter 10, the Tower of Babel, and the confusion of the tongues. And he goes on to make the point, well, what Jay is concerned with is explaining the progression and kind of downfall of man. That the first thing that happened was he became aware of himself and the opposite sex, and from there they had children, and from there their sin became a thing, or became a prolific problem. There was rebellion, there were apostasy, obviously, the flood, the dispersion of the nations, and all of that started with this sex consciousness. And yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thread to kind of try to pull at, but I don't think you need this sex consciousness to explain it. You know what? I will throw a link in the description, and you can go and read the article and see if you agree with them or not. But personally, for me, this just did not cut it. Did not work. The other article is by, so again, JSTOR, shout out to them. Thank you so much for free stuff. A legal background to the Yahweh's, again, talking about J, use of good and evil in Genesis 2:3. This is by William Malcolm Clark, Journal of Biblical Literature, volume 88, number 3 in 1969. I'm not going to read from the very beginning, but his point, his angle, and I really appreciated this, is to look at the use of good and evil, and just as the title says, from a legal perspective. How is good and evil, not linguistically, but how is good and evil, the phrase, used over and over in Scripture, in the Old Testament in particular? And does it mean something in terms of judgment and who is allowed to determine that, things like that? And because you get the idea that when they eat from the tree of good and evil, God immediately judges them because of it, and He's the one who named it the good and evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So who is allowed to determine those things, and what is it they've gained? So a quick summary point here that he makes on page 7. Judgment in the Old Testament is ultimately a matter of God. Man exercises judgment only as the agent of God, and to distort this judgment means that one is held responsible before God. This whole article, I think, is worth reading, but it's pretty long. It's 13 pages, and I don't want to take up that much time doing it. But just, again, to emphasize this point, the judgment in the Old Testament belongs to God alone. And if man decides to do it, then they're responsible to God for making some other decision than what God has made. If you think about the idea of Euthyphro's dilemma and how we've talked about that, is good and evil something God just makes up arbitrarily, or is it some higher standard that He has? No, neither one. It's a false dilemma. The truth is that good and evil is defined by God's character. What He would do, who He is good. What He wouldn't do, who He's not, is evil. And so for man to try to decide what is good and evil is ultimately to ignore God. I mean, that itself would be an evil, because they are not considering the one who is good in that determination. So he goes through a lot of Old Testament passages. He's explaining a lot of examples of this is how this plays out. Whenever you see the phrase good and evil, whenever you see God determining something, it is always Him doing it. And he wraps that back around towards the end of the article and applies it to Genesis 2. And I'm just going to read a little bit here, where he sums up basically what I was trying to explain in the beginning, and I think he's spot on. So applied to Genesis 2, I think this investigation strengthens the position of those who say that the J emphasis is not on the content of knowledge, but on man's moral autonomy. Man takes upon himself the responsibility of trying, apart from God, to determine whether something is good for himself or not. It is not that man has no knowledge before and gains knowledge, or that to know good and evil means to experience evil in addition to good. Rather, man himself declares what is good. He does what is good in his own eyes rather than what is good in the eyes of God. So just there. That's exactly what I was trying to say in the beginning. It's not that he is gaining knowledge in that he has somehow didn't understand good and evil prior to eating from the tree, but now he does, because that makes the whole command moot. It's not that he has experienced evil, because that wouldn't make him like God. God hasn't experienced evil. What he's picking up on is that when Adam and Eve ate from the tree, they determined for themselves what would be good. Eve looked upon it and said, hey, this is lovely to the eyes, and it's good for making one wise. And so she was determining for herself in that moment, this must be good for me, even though God said not to. So who is her focus on in that moment? It's purely selfish. It's a prideful position, and she is determining good and evil in that moment. that is the position of God. He should be, he is the only one who can determine good and evil. And by acting in that way, by eating from the tree, she has experienced good and evil. And so that makes her like God. Well, in both of them, Adam and Eve, makes them like God, but not that he has somehow experienced evil, just that he knows there are options. You can follow me or you cannot. And now that they have decided to follow their own will, they understand they can follow him or not. And he is just good. We don't know when the angelic rebellion happened, but he has had higher beings than us rebel. And the last thing he wants is for them to now, as the narrative goes, reach out from the tree of life and eat from that, and essentially become a bigger pain. And Matt's summary of it. The question is, why do they immediately say, I'm naked? That still seems to be left out of this explanation. And he does have an answer for that. So the theme of the command is not dropped in 2:17 and 3:8, speaks of man's hearing the voice of Yahweh Elohim. This seemingly innocent comment is taken up in verse 10 when Adam says, your voice I heard in the garden and I was afraid, for I was naked, so I hid myself. Each of these four statements has more than one meaning in the J's typical playing on words. Man has not heard the voice of Yahweh, quote unquote, with all that phrase means in terms of obedience. In saying that he has heard and feared Yahweh, man shows how little he recognizes what he has done. The dialogue which follows is to lead man to recognition of what he has done. The voice is implicitly mentioned again in verse 17 when reference is made to the listening of the voice of his wife instead of to the voice of Yahweh. So he's pointing out in Jay's play on words, right? Jay is saying, or Adam, when he says, I heard your voice and I hid, he really didn't. Hearing God's voice is a kind of poetic way of saying you have heard and you are obeying what he said. And yet Adam had not been obeying, right? He heard God. He recognized that he had not obeyed. And so what did he do? He tried to flee from the consequences he knew would be coming. He tried to hide himself from those consequences. So you see kind of a poetic thing playing out here. And why does that mean? Why do they immediately try to cover themselves? I do think it is, going back to, I think it was Dillman who said that it was the immediate consequences of sin. They looked at themselves, they heard God's voice, they realized they weren't doing God's voice, they had instead done their own. They now had knowledge that they could choose to do, so they could try to determine good and evil for themselves instead of considering what God said was good and evil. And so they hid. And the nakedness wasn't necessarily them. I think it was just a way of covering because of shame. That seems to make the most sense to me. And again, I'm not saying this has to be the only answer, but it seems to fit. If we're taking these puzzle pieces, they fit together the best here. It seems to account for all of the different things happening. So you have Adam and Eve before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, understanding right and wrong. That way the command makes sense. You have them eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and gaining something that made them like God, but without impugning God's character. So it makes sense that this could be Adam and Eve now understand that they can choose to go one way or choose to go his, right? They can choose to determine good and evil for themselves, or they can choose to repent to him. And obviously God knew that was an option the entire time. If he made beings to be free, if he made humans to be free, then he knew they had the opportunity to reject him or to follow him. And so that was that. Them gaining this knowledge makes them like God without impugning his character. And really, if you take the idea that when he says they have become like us, if that is him and the angelic beings, then it makes, I mean, if the angelic beings have already had a fall of their own, then this does make Adam and Eve like them as well. So I don't know, it just makes sense. And again, this is a scholarly article here that makes the same point. I don't think it's the sex consciousness thing that seems to fail on a couple levels. But yeah, I don't know. When I get some of these questions stuck in my head, and I want to make sure all the pieces fit together right. That's just how I think about things. I take an answer, you compare it to, or you try to put the puzzle together. And if some of the pieces don't fit, well, you shelve that answer and you go to something else and see if you can get all the puzzle pieces to fit. And really, I mean, this works for anything, although some of your theological questions get bigger and bigger, such as soteriology, which involves a lot of puzzle pieces, right? But that's how I dismantle Calvinism. Some of these puzzle pieces just don't fit, all right? I've got a pretty good picture, but the edges aren't finished. They're not smooth. They've got little janky edges, and I didn't like that. But now, what Leighton Flowers has termed provisionism, inclusivism, whatever you want to call it, has a more complete picture. And even that, when Billy and I started a few years ago, we didn't understand the faith pistis relationship, and that plugged some holes, filled in some stuff. I begrudgingly became an open theist. I'm still mad about that, but that filled in some holes. That really ironed out some stuff, smoothed the edges more. So constantly as things come up where I'm like, I don't know how that fits together, either in my own or my own theological picture, or in its own context, smaller questions like the knowledge of good and evil. What is that? I want to know. I want to piece it together. And so tying this, all that, to tie this to the bigger question of soteriology, when we talk about the fall, we talk about the consequences of the fall, we often get tied up in what happened. Did Adam and Eve, were they free, and did they lose it? Like, what were the consequences? Well, if we understand rightly what the knowledge of good and evil is, it is an addition to them. It is the ability now to decide for themselves what is good or what is evil. That in itself is an evil, right? They should be listening to God, but nowhere do we see the idea that the gaining of this ability to choose for themselves good or evil, or the understanding that they can do this, means that they can't choose what God has determined good and evil is. It doesn't mean that they can't repent. It just means now they have what we tried to point out over and over and over in the book of Romans, the option to follow the Spirit or follow the flesh. I've placed before you today life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life. Like, this moment at the fall is what God is fighting against from that point on. And you see it over and over. Choose life. Choose God. Follow the Spirit. Don't try to decide for yourself what is good and evil, because ultimately you rejecting God is evil itself. And anything that you choose, it doesn't matter what you think is good, that's going to be evil, because you're rejecting God and not repenting to Him. So, yeah, it plays an important part, I think, and it's probably, given the fact that I think people were surprised I was asking the question in the first place, I don't think too many people have tied that together in quite that way. But if you have any thoughts about that, email us, BibleBrodown@gmail.com. Join the Facebook group. We'd love to have you there. Still a cordial place. I think we might be over 1,000 members, 900 and something. I don't know, there's a lot of people in there. And it is not really, some of the people in there with opinions who differ from mine don't want it to grow, because they like it being smaller. They like it being cordial. They like being able to go in there and talk about other stuff besides, certain soteriological fights that happen over and over. So, yeah, this is the kind of group that we like, the group the way it is, where you're open to ask questions about any random topics. What was the tree? Did we eventually get to eat from it? Stuff like that. Like, who would even think to ask those things? And we did, and that's where we are now. So anyway, again, hope you're all staying safe. Love you, and God bless.